22nd of August, 1485, Bosworth Field. The air is thick, a damp, cloying shroud smelling of wet wool, sour sweat, and the metallic tang of fear. The world has been reduced to a churning morass of mud and blood under a gunmetal gray sky. This is not the clean, chivalrous pageant of ballad and song. It is a hellish forge where a kingdom's fate is being hammered out. The ground trembles with a low, inhuman hum, the sound of thousands of armored men moving, shouting, and dying. This cacophony is punctuated by the sharp, terrifying crack of primitive cannons, their smoke adding a sulphurous, acrid bite to the air, stinging the eyes and choking the throat. Amidst this chaos, a flash of gold and royal blue. King Richard III, the weight of a battle crown pressing down on his helmet, is a whirlwind of focused violence. His face, pale and strained, is a mask of grim determination. He is no longer a strategist, no longer a politician. He is a warrior, the last of a fierce Plantagenet line, and he has made his final, terrible calculation. His eyes are fixed on a single point across the field, the red dragon banner of the pretender, Henry Tudor. It is there in that one spot that history will either absolve him or condemn him forever. He gathers his last loyal knights, his household guard, a small, desperate island of chivalry in a sea of collapse and betrayal. This is not a retreat, not a rout. It is a charge. A final, magnificent, suicidal surge aimed at the very heart of the rebellion. For a fleeting moment, he believes it might work. He sees the enemy standard waver. But then, a glance to the side, to the hill where Lord Stanley's thousands stand like statues, their banners hanging limp. They do not move. They will not intervene. In that instant, the cold, clammy touch of utter betrayal is more chilling than the August air. He understands. He is alone. The world narrows to the length of his sword, and the screaming faces of the enemy closing in. This was the saga of him. The last English king to die in battle. A man who would lose not only his life and his throne on this wretched field, but something far more precious. His name, his honor, and his very identity for the next 5 centuries. This is the narrative of him, Richard Plantagenet, a man whose story is perhaps the most potent example in history of how the victor's ink can be more lethal than the victor's sword. To understand this man, we must first grapple with the central dramatic paradox that defines his legacy. How did a ruler, praised in his own time by many for his piety, his sense of justice, and his unwavering loyalty, become the archetypal tyrant, the monstrous, child-slaying hunchback of Shakespearean infamy? The core question that echoes down from the bloody mud of Bosworth is, why? Why was his reputation so systematically and utterly destroyed? Was he truly the monster that the Tudor chroniclers painted? A villain whose evil deeds provided all the necessary material for his own damnation? Or was he a victim of the most successful character assassination in history, a necessary sacrifice on the altar of a new dynasty, the Tudors, whose own claim to the throne was so fragile, it could only be secured by obliterating the reputation of the man they had violently overthrown? The entire subsequent chronicle of his life and death must be constructed as a deep and comprehensive answer to this single, burning question. We must strip away the layers of myth, legend, and propaganda to find the man beneath, a man driven by forces and fears that were forged in the brutal, chaotic world that spawned him. His tale is not merely the story of a single king's downfall, but a profound lesson in the nature of power, the writing of history, and the terrifying permanence of a well-told lie. We must journey back to the world that made him, a world where the crown was a poisoned chalice, and the Kingdom of England was a fractured, bleeding beast. To understand Richard, we must first return to the world of the late 15th century, a geopolitical chessboard drenched in blood and defined by exhaustion and transition. The great, defining conflict of the medieval age for England, the 100 Years' War, had finally sputtered to its ignominious end. The English lions, once lords of vast swathes of France, had been driven back across the Channel, leaving behind nothing but debt, bitterness, and a generation of restless, unemployed soldiers who knew no trade but violence. This created a perfect storm within the kingdom. The central authority of the crown, weakened by the disastrous reign of the mentally fragile King Henry VI, had crumbled. In its place rose the overmighty subjects, powerful dukes and earls with private armies who eyed the throne not with reverence, but with hungry ambition. This power vacuum ignited the dynastic struggle we call the Wars of the Roses, a brutal 30-year civil war between two branches of the Plantagenet family. The House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, and the House of York, symbolized by the white. It was not a war of grand ideologies, but a savage, intimate, and often dishonorable series of conflicts. Less like a continental war, and more like a city-spanning gang fight, marked by betrayals, summary executions, and the shocking reversal of fortunes. While England was busy devouring itself, the wider world was in flux. The once mighty Ottoman Empire had captured Constantinople just a few decades earlier, sending a shockwave of fear through Christendom. In Spain, the Reconquista was nearing its final stages, forging a new European power. And in France, the cunning Louis XV, the universal spider, was patiently weaving his web, consolidating royal power and watching with satisfaction as his old English enemy tore itself to pieces. It was into this world, a world of broken faith, relentless violence, and precarious power, that Richard, the youngest son of the Duke of York, was born. He was a product of this chaos, and its lessons would be etched into his very soul. Richard's character was not born in a vacuum. It was forged in the crucible of unimaginable trauma and political upheaval. A childhood that would instill in him both a remarkable resilience and a set of deep-seated psychological triggers that would later dictate his most fateful decisions. He was born in 1452, the 11th of 12 children of Richard, Duke of York, the man whose claim to the throne was the spark that lit the flame of the Wars of the Roses. For his first few years, he lived the privileged life of a high-born son, but this world shattered when he was just 8 years old. In the brutal winter of 1460, his father and one of his older brothers, Edmund, were defeated at the Battle of Wakefield, captured and executed by Lancastrian forces. The severed head of the Duke of York, adorned with a paper crown in mockery, was impaled on the walls of the city of York. This was not a distant political event for the young Richard. It was the savage murder of his father, a foundational trauma that taught him his first and most brutal lesson. In the great game for the throne, there is no mercy, and defeat means not just political failure, but utter annihilation for oneself and one's entire family. He and his brother George were sent into exile across the Channel for their own safety, becoming fugitive princes dependent on the whims of foreign rulers. This experience of helplessness and uncertainty was seared into his memory. When his eldest brother, the charismatic and brilliant Edward, returned to England, won a decisive victory at Towton, and seized the throne as King Edward IV in 1461, Richard's life was transformed again. He was brought to live in the household of the powerful Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, where he received the martial and political education of a great lord. It was here that his defining characteristics began to emerge. A quiet intensity, a deep piety, a fierce intelligence, and above all, an almost superhuman sense of loyalty to the man who had avenged their father and restored their house. His brother, King Edward. He had seen the abyss of chaos, and he would spend the rest of his life clinging to the principles he believed could hold it at bay. Order, legitimacy, and unwavering loyalty to the House of York. Richard's first true steps into the great and bloody game of English politics were not those of a plotter or a schemer, but of a remarkably capable and steadfastly loyal servant to his brother, the king. While his other brother, the notoriously fickle and ambitious George, Duke of Clarence, plotted with the Earl of Warwick against their own flesh and blood, Richard remained the unwavering bedrock of Yorkist support. He proved his mettle on the battlefield during the turbulent period of 1470 to 1471, when Warwick and Clarence betrayed Edward, forcing the king into a brief exile and restoring the pathetic Henry VI to the throne. Richard fled with Edward, sharing his hardship, and was instrumental in the daring campaign that followed. At the decisive battles of Barnet, where the kingmaker Warwick was finally killed, and Tewkesbury, where the last Lancastrian heir was slain, the teenage Duke of Gloucester commanded one of the 3 divisions of the Yorkist army. He fought with a courage and tactical acumen that belied his youth, earning a reputation as a formidable military leader. But it was in the north of England, where Richard truly came into his own. Edward IV entrusted him with the administration of this vast, notoriously rebellious, and strategically vital region, bordering the hostile Kingdom of Scotland. As Lord of the North, Richard governed for over a decade with a skill and sense of justice that was almost universally praised. He established the Council of the North, a body designed to provide swift and affordable justice for the common people, bypassing the corrupt and slow courts of London. He was seen as a fair landlord, a pious benefactor to the church, and a vigilant defender of the border. It was in the north that the first image of Richard was cemented, not as a tyrant, but as a just prince. The good Lord Richard, a man who understood the people and brought order and stability to a lawless land. This period is crucial to understanding the later paradox. For the people of Yorkshire, the Machiavellian monster of Tudor propaganda was unrecognizable. Their Richard was a hero, a perception that demonstrates he was, at the very least, a highly skilled and effective ruler when acting as a subordinate, a loyal lion's whelp guarding his brother's kingdom. To truly understand the man who would become Richard III, we must look beyond the battlefield triumphs and administrative successes and uncover the inner demon, the secret motivation that was the engine of all his actions. This was not a simple lust for power, as his enemies would later claim. It was something far deeper, more complex, and more personal. A pathological fear of chaos rooted in the foundational traumas of his childhood. He had witnessed firsthand the destructive consequences of a weak king and grasping, overmighty nobles. He had seen his country bleed, his father's head on a spike, and his family torn apart by the instability that followed. For Richard, chaos was not an abstract political concept. It was a visceral, terrifying force. Consequently, he developed an almost fanatical devotion to the principles he believed were the only bulwark against it: order, hierarchy, and above all, unquestionable legitimacy. His entire worldview was built upon a rigid, almost puritanical belief in the sacred right of the House of York, which his brother Edward embodied. Anything that threatened this order, the ambition of the old Lancastrian nobility, the vacillating loyalty of his own brother George, or the rise of new, grasping families at court, was not just a political threat, but a moral evil, a cancer that had to be cut out before it could consume the kingdom again. This is the key to his psychology. He saw himself not as an ambitious man, but as a physician to the body politic, a reluctant but necessary surgeon willing to take extreme measures to preserve the health of the realm. His ruthlessness, when it appeared, was not born of sadism, but of this cold, unwavering conviction. He believed that the survival of the Yorkist dynasty and the stability of England were one and the same, a holy cause for which any sacrifice was justified. This inner demon, this obsession with order, would make him an incredibly effective and loyal servant to a strong king like Edward. But it would also, after Edward's death, provide him with the perfect justification for his own truly shocking and realm-altering actions. The single most important and defining relationship in Richard's life, the fateful encounter that shaped his path and ultimately sealed his doom, was his bond with his older brother, King Edward IV. This was not merely a relationship between a monarch and his subject. It was a deep, complex, and psychologically charged alliance that formed the very axis of Richard's world for over 2 decades. Edward was everything Richard was not: tall, handsome, charismatic, affable, and notoriously self-indulgent. He was the sun in splendor, the golden son of the House of York, who had avenged their father and seized the throne through sheer force of will and personal magnetism. For the younger, more serious and intense Richard, Edward was more than a brother. He was the living embodiment of the Yorkist cause, the symbol of the order and legitimacy that Richard craved. He served Edward with a loyalty that was absolute and unquestioning, a devotion that stood in stark contrast to the treasonous scheming of their middle brother, George, Duke of Clarence. Richard was Edward's right hand, his most reliable general, his most trusted administrator, the man he left in charge of the volatile North. In return, Edward showered Richard with lands, titles, and immense power, making him the wealthiest and most influential magnate in the kingdom. Yet, there was a fundamental difference in their natures that planted the seeds of future tragedy. Edward, for all his brilliance, ruled with a certain pragmatism and a willingness to compromise, most notably in his shocking marriage to the commoner Elizabeth Woodville, a decision that elevated her grasping family, the Woodvilles, and alienated much of the old nobility. Richard, the idealist, viewed this as a grave error, a contamination of the court that threatened the very stability Edward had fought so hard to achieve. He remained loyal, but a quiet disapproval festered. He was the shadow to Edward's sun, the disciplined iron to Edward's glittering gold. This dynamic of absolute loyalty to a man whose judgment he may have privately questioned defined him. It was Edward's sudden, unexpected death in 1483 that would shatter this world, leaving Richard to confront his brother's legacy and the chaos he felt it had unleashed, alone. The delicate, glittering, and rotten edifice of the Yorkist court, held together for over a decade by the sheer force of King Edward III's personality, shattered the moment he died on the 9th of April, 1483. His death, likely from complications of a notoriously excessive lifestyle, plunged the kingdom into immediate crisis. The heir, Edward V, was a boy of just 12. According to the late king's will, his youngest brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who was up in the north at the time, was to be named Lord Protector of the realm until the young king came of age. This set the stage for an immediate and inevitable collision. The boy king was in the physical custody of his mother's family, the Woodvilles, led by the Queen Dowager, Elizabeth Woodville, and her ambitious brother, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers. The Woodvilles were the new men, of Edward's reign, widely despised by the old nobility as greedy upstarts who had monopolized royal patronage. They knew that a protectorate under the stern and puritanical Richard would mean the end of their power. Their plan was to rush the young king to London for a swift coronation, thereby ending the need for a protectorate and allowing them to rule through the puppet boy king. Richard, receiving the news, understood the stakes instantly. In his mind, allowing the Woodvilles to seize control was tantamount to surrendering the kingdom to the very chaos and factionalism he so abhorred. He believed, perhaps correctly, that they would sideline him and eventually destroy him. His first move was one of shocking speed and ruthlessness. Intercepting the royal party on its way to London, he arrested Earl Rivers and other Woodville allies and took physical possession of his nephew, the young king. This was the Protector's gambit, a decisive act of force that was technically legal under the terms of the will, but which felt to many like a coup. He entered London not just as the grieving uncle, but as the master of the situation, a man of iron will asserting his authority. The first blood had not yet been shed, but the price of power was already being calculated, and the first fateful steps on a dark path had been taken. In this high-stakes game for the soul of England, Richard's primary antagonist was not a single man, but a collective entity, a faction that represented everything he found corrupt and dangerous in his late brother's kingdom, the Woodville family. This was the she-wolf and her brood, as their enemies saw them. At their head was the formidable Queen Dowager, Elizabeth Woodville. She was a woman of remarkable beauty, ambition, and tenacity, who had risen from the minor gentry to the throne through her marriage to Edward IV. She was a prolific mother, providing the king with 2 sons and numerous daughters, but her elevation also brought with it a vast and hungry clan of relatives. Her father, her 5 brothers, her 2 sons from a previous marriage, and a host of other kin were all promoted to the highest echelons of the nobility, given key positions at court, and married into the richest and most powerful families, often against the will of the established aristocracy. To the old guard, lords like Richard of Gloucester and the Duke of Buckingham, the Woodvilles were vulgar parvenus, symbols of the erosion of traditional hierarchy and the dilution of noble blood. They were perceived as greedy, arrogant, and politically inept, a faction whose power rested solely on their access to the king's bedchamber. When Edward IV died, this simmering resentment exploded into open hostility. The Woodvilles represented a direct threat to Richard's vision of an orderly, noble-led government. They controlled the heir, Prince Edward, and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury. Their goal was a swift coronation, which would make the 12-year-old boy king in his own right and allow them to rule in his name, effectively marginalizing the appointed Lord Protector. The macro-level conflict, therefore, was a clash of 2 irreconcilable visions for England's future. Richard's austere, hierarchical, and aristocratic model versus the Woodvilles' more fluid, meritocratic, and family-based power structure. It was a battle between the old and the new, and Richard, the champion of the old order, felt he had no choice but to act decisively to excise what he saw as a cancerous growth from the heart of the kingdom. The decisive moment, the psychological breaking point where Richard of Gloucester ceased to be a mere protector and began his transformation into a usurper, was the instant he chose to permanently delegitimize his own brother's children. This was his crossing of the Rubicon, a fatal mistake from which there could be no retreat and no forgiveness. After securing the young King Edward V in the Tower of London, then a royal residence as much as a prison, and neutralizing the primary Woodville leaders, Richard's position was still precarious. The plan was still, ostensibly, to proceed with Edward III's coronation, but a dark whisper, a seed of an idea, began to grow, likely planted or nurtured by his key ally, the Duke of Buckingham. This was the claim that his late brother, Edward IV, had been previously contracted to marry another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler, before he secretly wed Elizabeth Woodville. In the canon law of the 15th century, a pre-contract was as binding as a marriage. If this were true, Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was bigamous and invalid, and all of their children, including the two young princes in the Tower, were illegitimate bastards with no claim to the throne. The next legitimate heir, following the execution of their treacherous brother George, was Richard himself. To embrace this story was a monumental gamble. It meant publicly declaring his beloved brother a perjurer and a lecher, staining his memory forever. It meant disinheriting his innocent nephews, branding them with the deep shame of bastardy. On the 22nd of June, 1483, a sermon was preached at St. Paul's Cross in London, publicly laying out this claim. This was the point of no return. In that moment, Richard understood that he had unleashed a force he could not recall. He had chosen the path of total victory or total destruction. He could no longer be the loyal uncle guiding his nephew to the throne. He had to become king himself or risk being destroyed as a traitor and a slanderer. The psychological toll of this decision must have been immense, requiring him to shatter the very icon of loyalty, his bond with Edward, that had defined his entire adult life. He had stepped into a moral abyss. Richard's seizure of the throne was not presented to the public as a naked power grab. It was masterfully framed as a reluctant but necessary act to save a kingdom teetering on the brink of chaos. He and his allies, particularly the Duke of Buckingham, orchestrated a brilliant and swift political campaign to sell this narrative to the political nation. The lords, the gentry, and the powerful merchants of London. The chaos he sought to exploit was the widespread fear of another minority rule, which in England's recent past had always led to factional strife and civil war, as seen during the disastrous reign of Henry II. The Woodvilles, with their perceived greed and unpopularity, were the perfect embodiment of this threat. Richard positioned himself as the only viable alternative, a mature, experienced, and proven leader, a man of royal blood, celebrated for his military prowess and his just governance in the north. The story of Edward IV's pre-contract was the legalistic key that unlocked the door to the throne. It provided a veneer of legitimacy, a reason that could be argued in sermons and presented to Parliament. A petition, known as the Titulus Regius, was drafted and presented to an assembly of the three estates of the realm, lords, commons, and clergy, formally laying out the case for the prince's illegitimacy and offering the crown to Richard as the only true and undisputed heir of the House of York. The document was a masterpiece of political propaganda, portraying Richard as a man of conscience who was persuaded to accept the heavy burden of kingship only for the good of the realm. The speed of these events was breathtaking. Within a matter of weeks, Richard went from Lord Protector to King-elect. He expertly manipulated the fears of the nobility, the legal system, and public opinion to create an atmosphere where his coronation seemed not like a usurpation, but like a restoration of order and a deliverance from impending civil war. He was the savior from the chaos, the strong hand that England so desperately needed. At least that was the story he told, and for a brief, shining moment, the kingdom seemed to believe it. The 26th of June, 1483, Westminster Abbey. This was the scene of Richard's greatest triumph, the culmination of his audacious and perilous gambit. The air inside the vast Gothic cathedral was heavy with the scent of beeswax, candles, and incense, a sacred perfume designed to sanctify the raw act of political power that was about to unfold. Light, fractured by the immense stained glass windows, painted shifting jewels of color across the ancient stone flags where every English king, since William the Conqueror, had been crowned. The space was filled with a nervous energy, a rustle of silk and velvet, the glint of heraldic banners, and the low murmur of the assembled nobility, clergy, and London dignitaries. They were all here to witness and, by their presence, to legitimize the transfer of the crown. And then, the procession. Richard, dressed in robes of purple and crimson, walked with a deliberate, steady pace. He did not look like a cackling tyrant, but like a solemn and pious prince, his face a mask of gravitas. The chroniclers noted his composure. This was the climax of Act 2 of his life, the moment he stepped from the shadow of his brother into the full, brilliant, and dangerous glare of sovereignty. The ceremony was a piece of magnificent theater, every ritual gesture steeped in centuries of tradition. He was anointed with holy oil, a symbol of his divine selection. He was handed the orb and scepter, the symbols of his temporal power and justice. And then, the Archbishop of Canterbury raised St. Edward's crown, the ancient, sacred symbol of English monarchy. As that immense weight of gold and jewels was lowered onto his head, Richard III became the undisputed King of England. For a man obsessed with order and legitimacy, this moment must have felt like the ultimate vindication. He had not stolen the crown. He had rescued it. He had restored the proper line, purged the corrupt, and saved the kingdom. In that hallowed space, under the gaze of God and his subjects, he was not a usurper. He was a king. At the summit of his power, in the moments and months following his magnificent coronation, we must attempt to reconstruct the psychology of Richard's triumph, to understand the profound moment of hubris that gripped the new king. He did not see himself, as his enemies did, as a ruthless usurper who had disinherited his own nephews. In his own mind, he was a reformer, a savior, a man of destiny who had been called upon by God and the people to cleanse a corrupt realm. This was not mere self-deception. It was a conviction rooted in his deepest held beliefs. He genuinely believed the story of the pre-contract and the illegitimacy of Edward's children, or at the very least, he convinced himself of its necessity and therefore its truth. He saw his actions not as a betrayal of his brother, but as a painful but necessary correction of his brother's greatest sin, the foolish and illegitimate marriage to Elizabeth Woodville that had poisoned the court. He was restoring the honor and integrity of the House of York. His first acts as king seemed to confirm this self-image. He embarked on a grand royal progress through the country, dispensing justice and patronage, particularly in the north, where he was greeted as a returning hero. He called the only parliament of his reign, which enacted a series of remarkably progressive laws, including reforms to the jury system, the establishment of bail for accused felons, and the translation of laws into English so that common people could understand their rights. This is the great paradox. The man who took the throne through an act of profound injustice immediately set about creating a more just legal system for his subjects. This was his moment of hubris. He believed that his good governance and his righteous intentions would be enough to win over the doubters, that the kingdom would see the wisdom of his actions and thank him for it. He was tragically blind to the reality that the manner of his accession had planted a seed of doubt and revulsion that no amount of good lawmaking could ever uproot. He saw himself as the kingdom's physician, but much of the kingdom saw him only as the man who held the bloody knife. While Richard was busy consolidating his power and reforming the laws of England, a new threat was gathering like a distant storm cloud across the English Channel. This threat was personified by his sworn enemy, a man who, until that point, had been a minor and almost forgotten figure on the European stage, Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond. To understand the conflict that would end at Bosworth, we must do a close-up on this antagonist. Henry's claim to the throne was, by any objective measure, incredibly weak. It came through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, a descendant of John of Gaunt, but through a line that had been born illegitimate and was explicitly barred from the succession by an Act of Parliament. He was the Lancastrian claimant by default, simply because everyone else with a better claim had been killed during the Wars of the Roses. He had spent most of his life, since the age of 14, as a fugitive and political pawn, living in exile in the Duchy of Brittany. He was an unknown quantity, a man with no military experience, no great wealth, and no significant power base in England. Yet he possessed three crucial assets: a patient and cunning political mind, the unwavering support of his formidable mother who conspired for him back in England, and his very existence as an alternative to Richard. He became a magnet for all of Richard's enemies: the die-hard Lancastrian loyalists, the disenfranchised Woodvilles and their allies, and most importantly, Yorkists who were horrified by Richard's treatment of his nephews. Henry Tudor represented the ultimate irony for Richard. Richard, the man who had seized the crown in the name of legitimacy and order, had through his actions created a situation where even a claimant with the flimsiest of titles could be seen as a viable and even preferable alternative. The personal drama between them was one of stark contrasts. Richard, the proven warrior prince of the blood royal, now seen as a tyrant, and Henry, the obscure Welsh exile, who could now style himself as a righteous avenger, a David coming to slay the monstrous Goliath. Despite the dark and controversial nature of his accession to the throne, the brief reign of Richard III was marked by a surprising and profound commitment to justice and administrative reform, creating one of the most compelling paradoxes of his story. Once he had the crown, he seemed determined to be the good king he had always believed he could be, a stark contrast to the tyrant of Tudor myth. In his one and only parliament in 1484, Richard oversaw a raft of legislation that was remarkably progressive for its time. He established the Council of the North as a permanent body, ensuring that the people of that remote region had access to swift and impartial royal justice. He introduced the concept of bail, seeking to protect individuals from lengthy imprisonment on trumped-up charges before their trials. He outlawed benevolences, the hated practice of forced loans or gifts from subjects to the crown, which his brother Edward IV had used extensively. Furthermore, he mandated that the statutes and laws of the land be translated from their traditional law French and Latin into English, and then printed and distributed. A revolutionary step aimed at making the law accessible and understandable to every literate Englishman, not just a clique of lawyers. These were not the actions of a self-serving tyrant. They were the actions of a king genuinely concerned with the welfare of his subjects and the fairness of his legal system. This is the mid-level view of Richard's rule, the onions and vegetables that add flavor and complexity to the main narrative. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable question: how could the man who may have murdered his own nephews in secret be so dedicated to providing justice for the common man in public? It suggests a man of profound contradictions, perhaps a ruler who believed that the illegitimate means of his rise could be sanctified by the legitimacy and goodness of his reign. He was attempting to build a legacy of law and order on a foundation of profound moral ambiguity. The political drama of Richard's reign cannot be understood without appreciating the devastating personal context that unfolded alongside it, a series of private tragedies that seemed to echo the growing cracks in his public authority. The most important secondary character in Richard's life was his wife, Anne Neville. Theirs was a union born from the heart of the Wars of the Roses. She was the daughter of his former mentor and eventual enemy, Warwick the Kingmaker. Their marriage had secured for him vast northern estates and cemented his power there. By all accounts, their relationship was one of genuine affection and partnership. In 1476, they had a son, Edward of Middleham. This boy was Richard's entire world, the sole heir to the new Ricardian dynasty, the justification for everything he had done. In 1483, after his coronation, Richard invested his son as Prince of Wales in a lavish ceremony at York Minster, presenting the future of his royal line to his adoring northern subjects. But then, in the spring of 1484, the unthinkable happened. The 10-year-old prince, his only legitimate child, died suddenly after a brief illness. The blow was catastrophic. The chroniclers reported that Richard and Anne were driven to the brink of madness by their grief. Beyond the immense personal pain, the death was a political disaster of the highest order. It shattered the future of his dynasty. He now had no heir. The kingdom could see that his line was fragile, perhaps even cursed. This personal loss was followed by another a year later, in March of 1485, when Queen Anne herself died, likely of tuberculosis. Now Richard was not only heirless, but also a widower. His enemies immediately began to spread poisonous rumors that he had poisoned his own wife in order to marry his niece, Elizabeth of York, the sister of the very princes he was accused of murdering to secure his throne. The weight of these personal losses, combined with the political pressures and dark whispers, must have left him an isolated and grief-stricken figure. A king whose personal world was collapsing just as his political enemies were beginning to circle for the kill. Just as Richard was grappling with the catastrophic loss of his heir, the first great political crack appeared in his regime, and it was directly linked to the darkest and most enduring mystery of his reign: the fate of the princes in the Tower. After Richard took the throne, his two nephews, the 12-year-old former King Edward V and his 9-year-old brother Richard, Duke of York, were housed in the Tower of London. They were seen playing in the gardens in the summer of 1483, and then they vanished. No one ever saw them again. The silence was deafening. By the autumn, a poisonous whisper had begun to snake its way through the kingdom. The boys were dead, and their uncle, the king, was their murderer. This rumor was a more potent weapon than any army. It transformed Richard in the public imagination from a flawed but legitimate ruler into an unnatural, monstrous tyrant, a Herod-like figure who had slaughtered innocent children to secure his crown. This narrative provided the moral justification for the first major uprising against him, the Buckingham Rebellion in the autumn of 1483. Ironically, it was led by his former chief ally, the Duke of Buckingham, the very man who had helped him to the throne. Buckingham's motives remain murky, perhaps a crisis of conscience, perhaps a grab for power himself, but he rallied the disaffected Woodville supporters and old Lancastrians under the banner of Henry Tudor, promising to place Henry on the throne if he would marry the prince's sister, Elizabeth of York. The rebellion was ultimately a failure, undone by bad weather and Richard's swift military response. Buckingham was captured and executed. but the damage was done. The revolt showed how vulnerable Richard was, and it cemented the alliance of his disparate enemies around the single figure of Henry Tudor. The disappearance of the princes became the original sin of his reign, a dark stain that would never wash out, a harbinger of the storm to come. The final fateful act of Richard's life, the decision that led directly to the bloody denouement at Bosworth Field, was his choice to meet Henry Tudor's invading army immediately and force a decisive battle. This was a critical error, born from a complex mix of psychology, strategy, and perhaps a touch of fatalism. When Henry Tudor landed with his small, motley army of English exiles and French mercenaries at Milford Haven in Wales in early August of 1485, Richard was in a strong position. He was the established king, with the full resources of the state at his command. He possessed a far larger army than the invader, and more reinforcements, particularly those of the powerful Stanley family in the northwest, were on their way. The logical strategic move would have been to shadow Henry's army, to contain it, to let it exhaust itself marching through hostile territory, while Richard's own forces swelled to an insurmountable size. Instead, Richard chose to rush to a confrontation. Why? The psychology behind this error is key. First, there was his overconfidence as a military commander. He had never lost a battle in his life and held a deep contempt for the inexperienced Tudor. He likely believed he could crush the rebellion with one swift, glorious blow, silencing his critics forever. Second, there was his warrior's ethos. He was a Plantagenet king, a man of action who met threats head-on, not through cautious maneuvering. To let Tudor march unchallenged through his kingdom would be a sign of weakness, an intolerable stain on his honor. Finally, there may have been a desperate need for finality. His reign had been plagued by rebellions, rumors, and the constant shadow of the pretender across the water. A great battle, a trial by combat, was a way to let God himself decide the matter, to finally put an end to the uncertainty that had haunted his brief and troubled reign. So he marched his army to the Midlands, seeking out his enemy, gambling everything on a single roll of the dice in the open fields of Leicestershire. The greatest catastrophe of Richard's life unfolded on the 22nd of August, 1485, on a patch of ground that would forever after be known simply as Bosworth Field. The day began with a series of ill omens. The king was said to have had terrifying nightmares, and his personal crown fell from his head during the preparations. The battle itself was a chaotic and brutal affair, far from the ordered contest Richard might have envisioned. His royal army, numbering around 10,000 men, significantly outnumbered Henry Tudor's force of about 5,000. Richard took the offensive, his vanguard under the Duke of Norfolk clashing fiercely with Tudor's experienced mercenaries. The initial stages of the battle were a bloody stalemate, but the decisive factor lay not in the main clash, but on the periphery of the field, where two private armies, numbering some 6,000 men, stood watching. These were the forces of Thomas, Lord Stanley, and his brother, Sir William Stanley. The Stanleys were the ultimate political survivors, masters of hedging their bets. Thomas Stanley was Richard's stepfather, yet he was also in secret communication with Henry Tudor. Richard, suspecting their loyalty, held Thomas Stanley's son hostage, a guarantee of his good behavior. For hours, as the main armies bled each other white, the Stanley banners remained motionless. Richard sent urgent messages, demanding their support. They refused. The stalemate was broken when Richard, seeing Henry Tudor move with only a small bodyguard, decided to commit to his final, desperate charge. As Richard and his knights plunged toward the Tudor standard, Sir William Stanley finally made his move. He ordered his army to attack not the Tudor forces, but the king himself. This was the ultimate betrayal. The king's flank was suddenly and catastrophically exposed. His charge was swamped, his loyal followers cut down. The collapse was immediate and total. The royal army, seeing the king's banner overwhelmed and the Stanleys turn against them, broke and fled. It was not a defeat. It was an annihilation, orchestrated by the treachery of the men Richard had been forced to trust. In the final, desperate moments of the battle, with his army disintegrating around him and the Stanley banners moving decisively against him, Richard III was faced with a choice. His aides brought him a swift horse, urging him to flee, to save himself and fight another day. It was a choice his predecessors had made. But Richard refused. According to the chroniclers, he declared that he would win or lose the battle as a king, or die in the attempt. This was the collapse of his political fortunes, but it was also his last chance to define his own end, to choose his own legend. He saw Henry Tudor's dragon banner a short distance away, surrounded by only a small contingent of bodyguards. In that moment, the warrior king eclipsed the politician. He saw a final opportunity, not to win the battle, but to end the entire war with a single magnificent act of personal valor. This was the last desperate gamble of a true Plantagenet. He lowered his lance, spurred his horse, and led his small household cavalry in a frantic, suicidal charge aimed directly at Henry Tudor. For a terrifying moment, it seemed it might succeed. Richard, a fearsome combatant, smashed into Henry's entourage. He is said to have personally cut down Henry's standard-bearer, Sir William Brandon, and came within a sword's length of the pretender himself. But he was hopelessly outnumbered. His horse became bogged down in the marshy ground, and he was pulled from the saddle. "Treason!" he cried, as Stanley's men swarmed him. He refused to surrender. Surrounded, on foot, fighting with his sword, the last Plantagenet king of England was hacked to pieces. His crown, which had rolled under a hawthorn bush, was picked up and placed on Henry Tudor's head. The desperate charge was a failure, but in that failure, Richard secured the one part of his legacy his enemies could never erase: the image of his own courage. He had lived as a king, and he would die as one, fighting for his crown on his own field. The death of the last Plantagenet king on the field of Bosworth was not merely the end of a battle. It was the end of an era and the beginning of a new one, defined by the systematic destruction of Richard's reputation. The hero's finale was brutal and ignominious. His body, stripped naked and covered in wounds, was slung unceremoniously over the back of a horse and paraded through the streets of Leicester, a final act of humiliation designed to prove beyond all doubt that the tyrant was dead. He was buried in a simple grave in the Greyfriars Church. With Richard's death, the victor, now King Henry VII, faced a critical problem. He had won the throne by conquest, but his hereditary claim was exceptionally weak. To secure his new Tudor dynasty, he needed to do more than simply defeat Richard in battle. He needed to utterly destroy his legitimacy, to erase the memory of the good Lord Richard and replace it with the image of an unnatural monster. This began the forging of the Black Legend, one of the most successful and enduring propaganda campaigns in history. The new regime immediately set to work. Richard's only parliament and all of its progressive laws were declared invalid. The document that made him king, the Titulus Regius, was ordered to be destroyed, with all copies burned and any mention of it forbidden on pain of imprisonment. Then, the Tudor court historians, men like Polydore Vergil and, later, the brilliant Sir Thomas More, began to craft the official narrative. They took the whispers and rumors of Richard's reign, the murder of the princes, the poisoning of his wife, and codified them as historical fact. They added physical deformity, a hunched back and a withered arm, to mirror his supposed moral corruption, physical manifestations of his inner evil. This was the birth of the Shakespearean villain, a caricature of malevolence so powerful that it would completely eclipse the far more complex reality of the historical man. The conflict of interpretations over Richard's legacy continues to this day, a testament to the enduring power of the Tudor narrative. For centuries, the verdict of history was clear and unequivocal, shaped by the genius of William Shakespeare, whose play Richard III cemented the image of the monstrous tyrant in the global consciousness. For the English establishment, particularly during the Tudor and Stuart periods, this portrayal was not just entertainment, it was a foundational political myth. It justified the Tudor dynasty, portraying Henry VII not as a usurper, but as a divine instrument sent to cleanse England of a bloody and unnatural tyrant, ending the Wars of the Roses and ushering in an age of peace and prosperity. This was the Tudor myth, and Richard was its principal villain. However, a counter-narrative has always existed, albeit on the fringes. This is the perspective of the Ricardians, those who defend the king's reputation. They point to his praised governance in the north, his progressive laws, and the lack of any concrete evidence linking him to the murder of the princes. They argue that his vilification was purely the result of politically motivated Tudor propaganda. In this interpretation, Richard is a tragic hero, a capable and loyal man forced into extreme measures by the actions of his enemies, a good king slandered by history's eventual winners. The perception of Richard is thus a mirror reflecting the viewer's own biases. To a believer in the Tudor myth, he is a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of ambition. To a Ricardian, he is a lesson in how history is written by the victors. The conflict is not just about the events of the 15th century. It's about how we interpret power, justice, and the very nature of historical truth itself. He remains a deeply divisive figure, a king whose trial by history has never truly concluded. So, we return to the central dramatic paradox and the core question. Why was Richard III so comprehensively slandered, his name transformed into a byword for tyranny? The final comprehensive answer is not a simple one. It lies in a perfect storm of Richard's own actions and his enemies' brilliant exploitation of them. He was not the innocent victim his most ardent defenders claim. His path to the throne was ruthless, swift, and shocking. The act of disinheriting his own nephews, based on the legally and morally dubious claim of a pre-contract, was a profound betrayal of family trust and the natural order. This singular act, more than any other, provided the fertile ground in which the seeds of his monstrous reputation could be sown. And his greatest sin may have been one of omission. His failure to ever produce the two boys, Edward and Richard, after he took the throne. Whether he killed them, or they died of natural causes, or were spirited away, his silence on their fate created a vacuum of information that his enemies filled with the darkest possible accusations. However, while Richard's actions provided the ammunition, it was the Tudor propaganda machine that built, aimed, and fired the weapon that assassinated his character. Henry VII's need to legitimize his own shaky dynasty was paramount. By painting Richard as an unnatural monster who had violated the sacred laws of God and man, Henry could style himself as a savior, a righteous avenger restoring order to the kingdom. What broke Richard's reputation was this fatal combination. His own ruthlessness gave the Tudors a credible narrative of tyranny, and their political genius transformed that narrative into an unshakable historical truth. He was, in essence, the perfect villain for a new dynasty that needed one, and his own moral compromises on the path to power made him tragically complicit in the destruction of his own legacy. The ultimate verdict of history on Richard III is therefore not really about one man's guilt or innocence. It is a profound and universal lesson about the very nature of power and memory. His story demonstrates with brutal clarity that history is not an objective record of past events, but a narrative constructed by those with the power to write it. The victor on the battlefield wins the crown, but the victor with the pen wins eternity. Richard's life shows the terrifying fragility of a reputation and the permanence of a well-crafted story. He could win at Barnet and Tewkesbury. He could govern the North with justice. He could enact enlightened laws, but he could not defeat the narrative that was forged against him in the halls of Tudor power and perfected on the London stage by William Shakespeare. His life is a testament to the fact that what people believe to be true can become more powerful than the truth itself. The story of the Hunchback tyrant was simply a better, more compelling, and more politically useful story than the complex reality of a flawed but capable ruler. It served a purpose, unifying a kingdom under a new dynasty and providing a simple moral lesson about the horrors of civil war and the evils of ambition. The universal lesson of his life, therefore, is a sobering one, that our legacy is never truly our own. It is a story told by others after we are gone, shaped by their needs, their fears, and their agendas. Richard III lost his crown at Bosworth, but he lost his name in the chronicles and on the stages that followed, a chilling reminder that the final battle is always the one fought for the narrative. The final frame of this epic saga does not take place in a muddy field in the 15th century, but under the sterile fluorescent lights of the 21st. The year is 2012. The location, a municipal car park in the city of Leicester. Archaeologists, guided by ancient maps and sheer determination, are digging beneath the asphalt, and then they find him. A human skeleton, hastily buried, its spine exhibiting a severe curvature, the scoliosis of the real man, twisted over centuries by propaganda into the monstrous hump of a fairy tale villain. The bones tell a story of their own, one more true than any chronicle. Forensic analysis reveals a man of a slight, almost graceful build, not a monster. But they also show the brutal manner of his death. Multiple wounds to the skull, including a massive blow that cleaved away part of the back of his head, and a humiliating dagger thrust to the pelvis, inflicted after death. Here, in this skeleton, the man and the myth finally collide. The physical reality of the last Plantagenet king, unearthed from his anonymous grave, forces a final confrontation with the 500-year-old legend. The discovery does not absolve him, nor does it confirm his guilt in the darkest accusations against him. But it gives him back a measure of his humanity. It reminds us that beneath the layers of political slander and literary genius, there was a real man who lived, fought, ruled, and died a brutal death for his crown. The image of these ancient, battle-scarred bones lying beneath a modern parking space marked R for reserved is the perfect, poignant aftertaste for this saga. A king's story, buried for centuries, finally brought back into the light.